Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to class today. Thank you for joining me, whether you're watching live or you're watching the recording. I appreciate you watching. Thanks for joining me. Thanks for watching today. So this week, we are starting to talk about responsive CSS. Right, responsive CSS. And in talking about responsive CSS, we're kind of taking what we know about HTML and CSS and we're manipulating it just a little bit. Right, like in the past, up until this point, we've primarily been focused on static values. Right, we even kind of looked at it last week when we started examining the boot camp stuff, right? I said, we're going to try to maintain, last week I said we're going to try to maintain sort of the things that we learned in Web 115. And in there, we just used static values for everything. Everything was a static value of pixels. And if it was too big or in the wrong spot, we had to go into the code and we had to manipulate the code and get it to move around. But with responsive CSS, we don't need to do that, right? And it's really, it's sort of the way that we do code in 2023, or build websites in 2023, is to always build them responsively. Right, so if we look at something like the Cleveland Community College website, right, you can see that on a full screen, it looks pretty good. I can scroll around and see everything. But if I take this viewport and I shrink it down, well, you can see that it contracts, right? And keeps everything in the window. And that's what we're talking about when we're talking about responsive CSS and responsive web design. And you can see that as I move this window around and change its size, things are getting bigger, things are getting smaller, things are moving around. And that's what we're looking at here. So we could look at something like, this section here. And we could see it shrinks down. Looks a little bit different. We can shrink it down a little more. And we can see things change, right? So when we're thinking about responsive web design, what we want to do here is we want to kind of think water. Right, so water doesn't really have a static size, right? Water kind of fills the container that it is poured into, right? It's fluid. And that's even how we'll describe responsive web a lot of the times, is that we'll describe it as fluid, right? It flows. So when we talk about things moving around, for example, on a web page, we will say, oh, that's reflowing. That's flowing to where we want it to be. And so what I'd like to do today is just talk about some of the concepts, show you all some of the concepts that are surrounding responsive web design, things of that nature, so that we can actually employ them into our site. And so the big thing about all of this, right, I want to move quickly through a few slides here, and then we'll get into our demos. So the big thing here is that we want to be able to build things once and have them be utilized on every device. Right, the vast majority of people in the entire world access things via a cell phone. Right? But most of the time when we're coding and we're designing websites, we're not doing that on a cell phone. So we don't see how things look on a cell phone immediately. But the majority of people are accessing websites in that way. So we want to be able to code something that works not only on a big screen, but works on a small screen, works on everything in between, right? Like I have 1080p monitors here. Other people have 4K monitors. Other people have Chromebooks that are like maybe 720p. And then you have your phone screen sizes that can vary wildly. So we want to be able to create one website, have it on all these devices, and have it look good. And believe it or not, there was actually a time in web development where you would have two websites. Right? You'd have a regular website, and then you'd have a mobile site. And the mobile site would usually look horrible. Right? Like, some of you might be old enough to remember that from, the early 2000s there. You'd have a mobile site. And that was just for people on their mobile phones. And there were a couple reasons why we would do that back in those days, right? Because that was, one of them was because that was the only way that we could kind of shrink things down to fit on a phone. And the other reason was because that was pre-4G, pre-3G, right? People's cellular data was at a premium. So you typically want something with fewer graphics, fewer videos, that would load faster, which is also why it was ugly. So we have three different types of units, right? We're typically used to using pixels. But with responsive web design, I have three primary types of units that I like to use that are dynamic, right? And percentages are the most intuitive. They're probably the ones that you're going to want to use most of the time, or percentages, because they're easy, right? I can say 100%, I can say 60%, I can say 50%, 40%, right? And whatever, percentage I say is, how much of the width of the container it's going to take up. Percentages for height are a little bit weird, which is why I prefer to use min height and still use a more static variable or a more static value type in that instance. Because if we say 100%, it's always going to be 100% of the viewport regardless for height. So if our code reflows, I mean, you could do min height 100%, I guess, but if our text reflows out of the bottom of, whatever area that's set to 100% height, it'll be a little bit weird. Typically nowadays, if we want to have something that fills up a whole screen, we'll use something called the aspect ratio. And have it done through media queries. Right? Because I can have a media query to where which we'll talk about a little bit later, we'll talk about media queries, but I can do media queries for cell phones, media queries for different sizes of desktops. And then set my aspect ratio to be a certain aspect ratio in each of those media queries so that it would always be a full page regardless of what we're in. But percentages are a big one. Another one's viewport units. And we'll see examples of all these in just a moment. I like using viewport units for text. If I want to have like a big title at the top of a screen, I like using viewport units for that. But you can use viewport units for basically anything, right? We have VW, VH, VMin, and VMax, which these are all really cool units that we can use here. VW is viewport width, VH is viewport height. So one VW, or one viewport width, is equal to 1% of the viewport width. And the viewport is your browser window, or it's the visible area inside your browser window, I should say. So when that browser window gets bigger or smaller, that 1% is going to change. And whatever you have using these viewport units, they're going to resize, they're going to grow, or they're going to shrink accordingly. VH is 1% of the viewport height. Since this is still 1% of the viewport height, it's still going to work the same way as percentages would. So we'd want to be careful with that if we want to have something, say, full height of our viewport. We'd want to be careful with that. Vmin is 1% of the smaller direction, which is kind of interesting, right? Because one of the things that we can do on our browsers or just between devices in general is some devices we have are landscape, and some device, well, I just drew a portrait device and said landscape, but some devices we have are landscape, which this is landscape. And some are portrait. So our vertical is portrait, our horizontal is landscape. But sometimes we want to make sure something sticks to the side of the sticks to the smaller side, regardless, right? So, for example, if we wanted to have a nav bar, maybe we want our nav bar to be on the side in a horizontal landscape view, but on the top of a portrait view. So we could have a relative side that's always going to be the minimum length of the viewport. So if we were to, change the size of our window to be a portrait window, or do something with the landscape, to make it wider, right? We could read vmin, and it's always going to be relative to that shorter side. Vmax, again, being the opposite. It's going to be the longer dimension regardless. And so we can get really creative in working with these and make things work really, really well. For us in web design projects, I like using viewport units a lot. You'll see me using viewport units a lot going forward from here. And the last of our units is M and Rem, right? And M and Rem are used as common units in responsive CSS, and they are relative sizes for fonts. So the M unit is relative to the font size of the parent, while the rem unit is relative to the font size of the root element. So what does this mean? Right, so we can actually switch over to a code window here and start actually looking at what this means. So I've already got a project started up here. Let me add a few files to it. Let me add an index.html. Let me add a style.css. And I will share these files with you all as they come through. Let's get our skeleton in here. Add a little title, link our CSS. Like so. Let's put our got ahead of need to put my href in there, which is going to be style.css, and there we go. All right, so let's say I have a main container here. And in this main container, I put an 1. And I give this H1, say, an ID of main underscore head. And in here we put main section heading. And let's add a paragraph size here. This is a quick paragraph for demonstration. Right, so now I have a main and I have 2 elements inside of it. We can go into my CSS file now. Let's go ahead and do some of our reset stuff that we talked about last week. So on my asterisk selector, I'm going to put box sizing, border box. I'm going to put font family, sans serif. And I think we're good for now. Like we'll add some more stuff later. But if we go ahead and open this site on our live server, we can see we have a main heading and a paragraph right on our live server. And I'm going to see if I can kind of position this to where I can edit a little bit and have that in our window at the same time. So let's do a little repositioning. You know what? It doesn't matter. I'll just drag the window in. I kind of wanted you all to see what was going on, but it's fine. I'll just drag it in and out. So here's what it looks like by default with no condition set here, with no style set. And so this is going to be, so if I use rem for these values, it's going to be relative to the size of, or if I use m, I should say, if I use m for these values, it's going to be relative to the size of the text specified in the main section, right? The parent, right? So if I say main here, and I make a font size of, say, 24 pixels. Right, so that makes everything bigger, and it makes everything bigger proportionally. Right, and I believe, you know, our header gets bigger because of it's set M by default now. So everything gets bigger. So this is kind of how, you know, the way things work when we're dealing with M, right? It gets proportionally larger, even though by this standard, everything should kind of be 24 pixels, right? Like if I look at this here, this paragraph, that's 24 pixels. Let's make a second paragraph here. I'm just going to copy and paste that. And so say this is another paragraph for demonstration, and I'll give it a class of P2, right? So in this instance, we have another paragraph here now. Maybe I don't want my header to be bigger. Maybe I want it to be the same size as the font size that's set for main, right? Well, we used hashtag main underscore head for that. And so when I use M or rem, everything revolves around the value 1, right? So if I want it bigger than the base size, I say 1 point however many rem. If I want it to be smaller than the base size, I would say something like, 0.8 rem or M. And if I wanted it to be the same size, I could say font size 1M. right? So now when we do that, we can have a look and we can see that our main section heading is the same size as our paragraphs, right? Because this is the font size, 24 pixels is the font size of the parent. And now everything here is relative to that font size of the parent. So I could hypothetically do something like for viewport width. In which case, when we do viewport width, 4 is 4% of the viewport width, and that is for each character. So each character takes up 4% of the viewport width. And so now this 1M is also going to be proportional to 4VW. So everything is going to be 4VW. And then the 1M is proportional. And you can see as I make my browser bigger and smaller here, that's the power of the VW, the viewport width. As my browser gets bigger and smaller, everything in the window is getting bigger and smaller accordingly, right? Because my viewport width is shrinking. So if it's 4% of the viewport width and my viewport width gets smaller, my text is going to get smaller accordingly. Well, maybe I want my base size to be 4 viewport width, but I want my heading to be bigger than 4 viewport width. So I can say 1.2M. Right? And so now basically my font size for my main head will be 1.2 times the size of the font size for its parent, which is the main section here. So now if we look at this, we can see it's slightly bigger than the paragraph text, just slightly bigger. If we wanted to see a drastic change, I could bump this number up a lot. I could bump it up to like 2M, right? And we can start to see a big, we can see a more drastic change here, because now it's 2 times the base font size. So this allows us to kind of establish proportions for our fonts for a specific area, right? Using M. So I can say, well, I want my base font size to be this, but I want things that are bigger than that to be this or this or this. And one of the interesting things that we can do with that is we can actually use M or rem to kind of create a font system for ourselves. Right, so for example, I could take and I could set, at this level, I could set a font size of 1.5 viewport width. And in doing so, I've not only set it on every item, I've set it on the root, which means in turn, we could use rem to establish different font sizes. So I could say, well, I want H1 to be font size 5 rem. H2 could be font size 3.5 rem. And then H3 could be 1.5 rem. All right, so now let's just add a little H2, H3 for some demonstrations. H2, demo, heading, level 2. H3, demo, heading, level 3. So now, when I see my site, I've created, essentially, a font system for my site. And so if I want to make the fonts bigger or smaller, proportionally, all I have to do is change one number. That one number being my root value for my font size. So if I want to make everything bigger, I change this to something like 3 viewport width. And so now H1 is 5 times 3 viewport width, which is 15 viewport width, 3.5 times 3 viewport width, so on and so forth. And so at this point, my fonts get huge at a full screen size. But now if we shrink our screen down, we can see them getting smaller accordingly. Which is kind of cool. And sometimes you might want a huge font like this. And other times you might not. And, some of the times you might want it to be big. You might want it to be this size. If your browser's this size, you might want this. This might look good. But like one of the things prior to that, like when we had 1.5 viewport width here, you saw here that this demo heading level 3 and this text here, that's pretty small on what would be phone resolution, right? On a window resolution, it's pretty big. But on a phone resolution, doesn't look as good. So that's a case where we might need a media query. Which I guess I can go ahead and talk about media queries. Let me see here. I'll throw up a media query slide really quickly. Talk about what that is. So when we're talking about media queries, a media query is more adaptive than responsive, right? So what we have to do with a media query is we have to specify a certain size or a certain screen type. And in doing so, we're basically telling our computer to, look for the screen to be a certain size. And if it reaches a certain size, swap out the old CSS with new CSS. So we can kind of think about a media query like a conditional in programming. It's waiting for the browser to have a certain condition met, and then it's swapping out CSS based on that. And so typically what we would do is something like this, right? We would do something like this, where we have one rule for our CSS. So our top rule is just what our CSS would be regularly. And then we have a completely separate rule for @media only screen and max design with device with 480 pixels. So that's sort of the thing that we do if it's mobile, right? And we can replace the logo with a mobile logo, or we can make it smaller. And so that's something that we could do here, for example. So I could write a media query, and we start that with @media. And we could say something like max width. Max width can be, let's say, 600 pixels. Right, I can make that value anything that I want it to be. There's also only screen and different things that I believe that are discussed in the module. When you look at the module content, we'll keep it easy for our demonstration here, because really it is this easy. And so if it gets to that point, what I can do is I can resize my font, my base font size. So I can say, oh, font size is now 3 viewport width. My root font size is 3 viewport width. All I have to change here, right, are the CSS rules that I want to change. So if there's CSS rules that I want to stay the same, I don't have to add them here. I just want to swap out the ones that I'm wanting to change. And so then what we see here is that if this works, right, we see, okay, our headings look like this. And then as we get bigger, you see right there's the jump. Right there is 600 pixels. Or what would probably be smarter here is if we changed the rem values for our H3. So I could say H3 and our paragraph, really, for that matter. So H3 and paragraph. Font size could be 2 rem, let's say. Right, so now at a small size, it's readable. And if we, and see, there's our jump. Right, there's our jump. And so we can see here our text here is readable until we hit about, really about here. So I might even want this to be something like max width of 1024 pixels or something like that before we change the screen or change the font size. So then and I need a reboot, so my browser is acting just a little bit slow. But we can see it's shrinking, it's shrinking, it's shrinking, it's shrinking. And there's the jump. So that's still pretty readable. There's the jump. Gets way readable again. And now it's shrinking, it's shrinking, it's shrinking, it's shrinking. And at the smallest size there, it's readable. Right? Probably not the most readable, but it's readable. Right? And so we can see it going from big to small. And we can see that little jump in there. The little jumpy jump where we're resetting. Like so. So let's add a few more things to our HTML so I can demonstrate just a few more concepts to you all. All right, so we can add a header here. Let's add a header. Let's add a footer. And in my header, I want to add a navigation. Now, I don't think we did it in this class last week, but if you're in some of the other classes, you might have seen me do a regular unordered list. In a regular unordered list menu is the word I'm looking for, menu for our site. I'm not going to do that. Once we get a little bit smarter and we learn about some of the things that we're learning about, say, in this class, where we start to learn about things like grid, we change the game and we don't have to do anything like that anymore where we're having to make some weird unordered list navigations. We can use what's called a nav tag, NAV, and we can just put links in there. ahref equals, we'll do that, and this will be a home page. And I'll just put a few links in here. We'll have a home. We'll have an about. We'll have a shop. And we'll have a contact. And we can look at what this looks like by default. Looks like that. Just 4 links shoved in side by side by side. We'll fix that in a little bit with CSS Grid, which will be pretty nice. I use grid more than I use Flexbox, so I'm going to talk about grid here in the live. But, if you don't, Flexbox is in, they're both in the module. And if you go through that material and you find you would like Flexbox for this application more than grid, because grid is a one-dimensional layout tool, Flexbox is a one-dimensional layout tool. I think I might have said grid there. Flexbox is a one-dimensional layout tool, where grid is a two-dimensional layout tool. I prefer grid just because I think it's super easy, and I hope you all do too. So I'm going to use grid here. But before we do that, let's just do a little bit of styling to what we have here, right? So we have our main, and I want it to have a particular width across, right? So instead of using a static width now, I'm going to say something like 70%. We'll give it a background color of white. And I'm going to want to make my body have a background color as well, just so this can stick out. Let's go with a dark red today. I'm feeling a dark red. So let's say something like a 6400. Let's make it a little purpley. 15. Like a dark red with a little bit of blue in it. Probably not even enough blue to make it look purple, but that's fine. So if we do that, we can see what we're working with here. All right, we can see we have our little margin there, so we probably want to fix that. So we can say padding 0 on the body there. And that'll fix that. Or also margin 0 on the body there should fix that. There we go. And when we resize our browser, we see that box will change. It'll always be 70% of our viewport window regardless. Like even if we take and drag it off this way, so I can make my browser even bigger. Come on, catch. It'll still scroll and get bigger and go in there. So that's what we want, right? That's the kind of thing that we want to see. And so I'd want to center that up. Maybe I want to make sure that it always goes down to the bottom. So I am going to add a margin 0 auto to center it up, and I'm going to add a min height of 100%. A min height of 100%. Remember to always add a min height. Well, yeah, that's not going to work. I actually need 100 VH to do that, because yeah. So I need 100 VH there. And remember, you'd always want to set that as a min. Right, because if my text was longer than the height of my window, I'd want it to be able to scroll off the bottom. All right, so let's add a little bit of padding on the main as well, so it's not right up against the edge. Since we're using rems here, I would want to use a rem size. So it would be relative to our font sizes as well. So I might say something like 0.8 rem. And we can see as it shrinks, it shrinks. And it looks good. So now we've seen percent in action, we've seen viewport height in action. I could replace 70% with 70 viewport width, and that's the same thing. Right, so we've seen that in action. We've seen M and REM in action. We've seen a media query in action. So let's add a little bit more styling to our site. Then let's do a little grid and let's call it a day. So let's focus our header element. It's 100% by default, right? But maybe I want to say, well, let's make this a height of 20 viewport height. Or I might even want to make this Vmax. I might even want to make this like Vmax or Vmin. So it can always be relative to the larger or smaller size. So I think I want to make this, let's make this 20 Vmax. Because I always want it to have some height to it, regardless of whether I'm on a phone or a browser. Vmax would be good here. Background color. Let's go for a dark blue here. So maybe we can kind of take our numbers from this one and just kind of flux them around. So 150064. Get ourselves a dark blue. And that's going to give us a nice dark blue header. And honestly, if that's all I'm going to do, I could do the same thing for my footer. So I can put comma footer here. And we end up with the same size of footer at the bottom. Now let's put our nav in a grid, which is going to be fun. So if I want to take that navigation and I want to put it in a grid, I want to start off by looking at nav. That nav tag. Because we're not in a unordered list or anything like that anymore. We're in a nav. And if I want it to be a grid, or the parent of a grid, in the parent of my links, which in this case is my nav tag, because my nav tag contains all of my links, I'm going to add display grid. Just like that. And so by default, just adding that, we see a change, right? Because it puts everything on one line. Because by default, grid is one frame. So it's 100% across, 100% across, 100% across, 100% across. And if I do some fancy stuff with my links, so if I say nav greater than a, color white, background color black. I used a little thing that we're going to talk about in the next module, which is an advanced selector here. This just means to select all A tags that are a child of a nav tag. And so we can see now we put a different color background behind them, so that color is different. And we can see it goes 100% across. Now, maybe I want my navigation to be the same size as my main content. So that's a width of 70 viewport widths. Right? So if we do that, we can see how that changes things, right? So now it's 70% of the width. And maybe I want to center it up. Margin 0 auto. Save that up. So now we see it nice and centered up, but I don't want my nav to be like this. I want my nav to be across. Well, I know how many items are in my grid or are in my nav, right? I have 4 of them. So watch what I can do. And this makes life so much easier and so beautiful, right? Makes it much easier. So what I do is I say grid, template, columns. And I do this in the parent, in the nav. I say 1 frame. Repeat that. Four times. Or actually, I would want to do repeat 4 times 1 frame. I always get that backwards. Repeat 4 times, comma, 1 frame. So that's 1 frame, 1 frame, 1 frame, 1 frame. That's 4 frames in a line. A frame is automatically going to resize. So now when I look at my site, we can see I have a nav that is always going to fit. And one of the things, we might want to change font size here, right? Font size 2 rem, right? We might want to change text align to be center. Right? So if I make the font a little bit bigger, I make my text align centered. Well, now I have a pretty cool looking nav here. But it's at the top up here. Right? We can put a little bit of padding on those links too. So let's put a little padding there. Padding, let's say 0.4 rem. Like so, just to get a little padding. Get a little padding there. So now we got something that's pretty cool there. But we might want to put a media query in here for the link size and make that link, or make that nav font size a little smaller. We have a lot of choices. Just for this demonstration, I'm just going to keep it the way we have it here. But it's at the top. It's at the top there, and maybe I want it at the bottom of this. We can do that too. Right? We don't have to do any sort of fancy positioning when we're using a grid. Right? Check this out. What I want to be able to do is I want to be able to take my grid, take the parent here, and put it at the baseline. I want to put it at the baseline of this header. Well, in order to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to make my entire header a grid. And I can do that again by adding display grid. So now that entire header is a grid. Right? If we go back and look at it, once we save, if we go back and look at it, it looks a little bit different, right? Because it's taking that one item that's already in there and it's trying to fit it to the entire height of my entire grid. So what I want to do now is I want to take that nav and I want to give it a height. Right? And this is a place where I might use a % height and say like maybe 30%. Right? Because that's going to be 30% of the parent container. So now it's 30% of the parent container's height. Always. May even make it a little bit smaller. May even make it like 25% of the parent height. That way I have 75% of the parent height that I can use for something else, like a logo. And 25% of the parent height goes to my nav. Now I want to be able to take that nav and I want to push it down. Right, so let's say I took this and I wanted to push it all the way down. Well, one thing I could do is just make another item, right? Make another something else. Some kind of div. Logo goes here, maybe. And put that in the head. Right, so we can give this an ID equals logo. And in here we could have a hashtag logo. Height is 75%. And it's pushed it down a little bit, right? But if I took and I said, oh, well, let's just take everything and push it to the bottom, I can go to my header here and add one line here where I can say align items. End. And align them to the end. And so we see that pushes everything down. Since this has some other elements and stuff on it, I think this is actually because of the text size. I think we would probably want to make the text size bigger or smaller here. Or make the height bigger. So make the height something like 35% and just like 65% here. I think it's probably what we're looking at. Yeah, you can see how it pushed it back up. So the font size is actually pushing this down because remember that when the font's too big for the container, it makes my container bigger as it's flowing. So I could do something like 1.5 rem here instead of that. Yeah, there we go. That gets us to where we want to be. Right, so now we have a nav, we have a place where we can put a logo. We could even do some other fancy stuff on this, right? Like check this, like if we put a border, like instead of black here, let's make that maybe a let's just leave it black and make it gray. That way we can work with it. So maybe I want in my header, right? So maybe I don't want it to apply to the footer. Also, I could take my header. I can make a border bottom 10px solid gray border style inset. No, that's not what I want to do. What is it that I want to do? Oh yeah. I wouldn't want to use a border here. I'd want to use like an inset box shadow. Yeah. I'd have to get a little fancy with it. That's what I'd want to do. So instead of border bottom, I would have to use. Let me look up my box shadow syntax. You remember that the internet is a resource for you all. I always have trouble remembering like which values go where in a box shadow. So we're going to change this border bottom to a box shadow. And we are going to make it, let's see, I think it goes around the clock the same way, but only the first two. So only right and bottom. And then if you go negative numbers, it goes left and up. Right? So I don't want it to go anything on the right. I want it to be 10 pixels on the bottom. I want it to be 0 pixels blurred, and I want it to be, let's say, a dark gray. So let's say something like 333. Or my favorite dark gray, 525252. And then we're going to change that to be inset, so it is inside the box instead of outside the box. So I believe that gets me what I want instead. Oh, it's a top. Or if it's inset. Yeah, if it's inset, I have to go in reverse, I believe. So I have to say something like 0, -10. Because it's inside instead of outside. Is that what I want? Yeah, that's what I want. Okay. Because the idea is here you just have like a 2-tier little looking little thing at the bottom there. We'd obviously use better colors. But, and I can use M and rem here as well. So if I know that my nav height is 35%, I might want to make this like, I don't think -20% would work. But let's find out. Yeah, no. Maybe -20 viewport. But yeah, it wouldn't be viewport height though either, would it? Oh, it's a little tricky one. So I might want to look at my font size, which is 1.5 viewport width, and do something like -4 rem and try that. Okay, yeah, that's getting us closer. Maybe -2.5 rem. Closer still. Let's go -2 rem. And that's the sort of thing that we want here, right? Like we'd use different colors, obviously. I didn't really think out colors. Right, I might even want to text align center this. I'm going to share this with you all as well afterwards. So there is that. But we've reached our hour mark. So we'd have our logo, which would go here. And then as we shrink our window down, we can see everything gets smaller relatively. So regardless, so, you know, our little 2-level navigation there still works regardless of how wide our browser window is. We go bigger, it works. It's all scaling accordingly. It's beautiful. And then at the end of the day, some of the things that we might want to think through are some more media queries, right? We might want to add some more media queries here to make some things jump at specific widths and heights, do various different things to sort of get us to where we would need to be. Right, and so since we've hit an hour here and I've demonstrated basically every concept that I wanted to demonstrate today, we'll go ahead and wrap it up here. So that's all that I have for you all for today. If you have any questions, if you're watching live or you're watching the recording, go ahead and get those. You know, if you're watching live while I'm wrapping up here, please get those in, whether you want to send them via email, via Teams, or via YouTube chat here. If you're watching the recording, send me an email, send me a Teams message, and I'll help you the best that I can with any questions that you have. I will be sharing this code with you all. We're going to put it on GitHub. In fact, let's go ahead and create us a GitHub, and we'll go ahead and push it. The idea for this semester, for this class, is I'm going to have one GitHub for the class. Then I'm going to put all the classes, or all of the week's demos inside, and you'd just get the same thing every week, basically. So we'll have a web 2015 fall 23 GitHub repo. And we'll get this pushed. So new terminal, cd up, git add all, git commit -a or -m, RWD demo upload. Then we can add everything from here. So we'd add our remote. And then git push origin master. So now I have the code online. I've got the bootcamp code here from last week. And now I'll send you this link today to the RWD code. So that's all that I have for you for today. Thank you for watching. We'll see you next time.